Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is the right thing at the wrong time. The rain hammered the tin roof of La Cantina Dorada that July evening in 1983, drowning out the mariachi music and laughter inside. 17-year-old Miguel Santos sat nursing a Coca-Cola, celebrating his first paycheck from the auto shop when the doors exploded inward. Men with machine guns swept the room like death incarnate, and Miguel's instincts, honed by years protecting his younger sister from neighborhood bullies, kicked in instantly. Without thinking, he tackled the quiet businessman at the next table, feeling the burn of a bullet tear through his shoulder as they hit the floor. Miguel had no idea he'd just saved Pablo Escobar. 3 weeks later, as mysterious money appeared in his family's mailbox and his sister received an impossible scholarship to America, Miguel began to understand that heroes and villains aren't always who they seem to be. His father's hidden photographs would soon reveal a truth that would shatter everything Miguel believed about courage, family, and the price of doing what's right. But the question that haunts him most isn't about Pablo Escobar. It's about what kind of man Miguel Santos is becoming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The antiseptic smell of Hospital San Vicente still clung to Miguel's clothes as he limped through the narrow streets of Barrio Antioquia, his left arm cradled in a sling that chafed against his neck. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the cracked pavement into a furnace that made his healing shoulder throb with each step. 3 weeks had passed since the shooting, but the phantom sound of gunfire still echoed in his ears during quiet moments. Miguel paused at the corner where Señora Martinez sold empanadas from her rickety cart, the same spot where he'd bought lunch every day since he was 12. She looked up from her oil-stained apron, her weathered face creasing into a mixture of concern and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "Mijo," she whispered, glancing around nervously before pressing a warm empanada into his good hand. "You should be more careful walking alone." Before Miguel could ask what she meant, she'd already turned away, busying herself with customers who weren't there. The empanada sat heavy in his palm, suddenly unwanted. This was the third person this week who'd acted strange around him, as if he carried some invisible mark that only they could see. The 2-story house he shared with his family came into view, its yellow paint peeling like sunburned skin. Miguel could hear his sister Carmen's laughter drifting through the open windows, a sound that had become precious since the scholarship letter arrived. UCLA, the envelope had read, with a return address that meant nothing to any of them. Full scholarship, room and board included, for a girl who'd never scored higher than average on any test Miguel knew about. His father, Roberto, sat on the front steps smoking a cigarette, his mechanic's hands still stained black despite the soap he'd scrubbed them with. At 45, Roberto Santos looked older, gray threading through his hair like wire, lines etched deep around his eyes from squinting into engine blocks and worry. "How was your first day back?" Roberto asked, though his gaze didn't quite meet Miguel's eyes. "Strange." Miguel settled beside him, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "People keep looking at me different. Señora Martinez acted like I had the plague." Roberto took a long drag, the ember glowing red in the growing dusk. "People talk, mijo. What happened at La Cantina? It's not every day someone does what you did." "What I did was stupid." The words came out sharper than Miguel intended. He'd replayed that night 1,000 times, wondering why he'd thrown himself at a complete stranger. The businessman had been nobody special. Average height, quiet voice, expensive but understated clothes, the kind of man who blended into crowds. "I could have been killed. But you weren't." Roberto's voice carried something Miguel couldn't identify, relief mixed with something darker, and neither was he. Who was he, Papa? Miguel had asked this question before, but his father's answers always felt incomplete. "The police never came to ask me about him. Don't you think that's strange?" Roberto flicked his cigarette into the street, watching it smolder against the asphalt. Sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions. The front door creaked open, and their mother, Elena, appeared with a glass of agua de panela, the brown sugar water sweet and familiar on Miguel's tongue. She'd been hovering over him like a guardian angel since he came home from the hospital, as if her presence alone could shield him from whatever forces had paid for his surgery. "Dinner's ready," she said, but her smile seemed forced. "Carmen wants to tell you about her English classes." Inside, the small house felt different somehow, not physically, but in the way shadows seemed deeper and conversations stopped when Miguel entered rooms. Carmen bounded over, her 14-year-old energy infectious as she chattered about verb conjugations and American universities. But even she couldn't mask the underlying tension that had settled over their family like dust. During dinner, Miguel noticed things he'd missed before. The way his parents exchanged glances when Carmen talked about her scholarship. How his father's hands shook slightly when he reached for his beer. The new deadbolt on the front door that hadn't been there before the shooting. "Keep having this dream," Miguel said suddenly, surprising himself. The words tumbled out before he could stop them. About that night. But it's not about getting shot. It's about his eyes. His parents went very still. "Whose eyes, mijo?" Elena asked carefully. "The man I saved. When I tackled him for just a second, he looked at me. And I swear I'd seen those eyes before, but I can't remember where." Miguel rubbed his temple, where a headache was building. "It's driving me crazy." Roberto pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile floor. "I need some air." As his father stepped onto the small balcony, Miguel caught sight of something falling from Roberto's shirt pocket, a small, folded photograph that fluttered under the kitchen table like a guilty secret. Miguel's fork clattered against his plate as he stared at the spot where the photograph had disappeared beneath the table. Carmen continued chattering about irregular verbs, oblivious to the sudden tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. Elena's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass, and Miguel could hear his father's heavy breathing from the balcony. "I'll get it," Miguel said, already pushing his chair back despite the sharp protest from his healing shoulder. "No." Elena's voice cut through Carmen's monologue like a blade. "I mean, it's probably just trash, mijo. Leave it." But Miguel was already on his knees, his good arm stretched under the table. His fingers brushed against the folded paper, and he could feel the worn edges, the kind of softness that came from being handled countless times. This wasn't trash. "Miguel, please." His mother's voice carried a note of desperation that made his stomach clench. Carmen had finally stopped talking, her dark eyes darting between her mother and brother with growing confusion. Miguel's fingers closed around the photograph just as Roberto's boots appeared in the doorway. The silence stretched taut as a guitar string about to snap. "Give it to me." Roberto's voice was quiet, but Miguel heard the steel underneath, his father's mechanic hands. Those same hands that had taught Miguel to change oil and gap spark plugs now hung at his sides like weapons. Miguel looked down at the photograph in his palm. It was small, maybe 3 by 4 inches, and old enough that the colors had faded to sepia tones. He could make out figures, but the light was wrong to see details. All he needed to do was unfold it, tilt it toward the hanging bulb above the dinner table, and maybe the pieces of this puzzle would finally start making sense. "Miguel." Roberto stepped closer, and for the first time in his life, Miguel felt afraid of his father. Not of violence. Roberto had never raised a hand to his children, but of the secrets that seemed to pour off him like heat from an engine. "What's going on?" Carmen's voice was small, confused. "Why is everyone acting so weird?" Miguel looked at his sister, really looked at her. 14 years old, brilliant enough to earn a mysterious full scholarship to one of America's best universities, innocent enough to believe their family had simply been blessed by good fortune. She deserved better than lies, better than the suffocating weight of secrets that had settled over their house like a shroud. But when Miguel met his father's eyes, he saw something that made his decision for him. Roberto wasn't just afraid, he was terrified, the kind of bone-deep fear that came from knowing exactly how much you had to lose. Miguel placed the photograph on the table without unfolding it and slid it across to his father. Roberto's shoulders sagged with relief, but his hands shook as he pocketed the photograph. "Gracias, mijo." "But I want answers," Miguel said quietly. "Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Whatever this is, whatever you're hiding, it has to do with that night, doesn't it?" Elena made a sound like a wounded animal, quickly stifled behind her napkin. "Some things are better left buried," Roberto said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Tell that to the bullet scar on my shoulder." Miguel's voice hardened. "Tell that to Carmen's miraculous scholarship, or the hospital bills that vanished into thin air, or the way half the neighborhood looks at me like I'm carrying the plague." Carmen's fork hit her plate with a sharp clink. What hospital bills? What scholarship problems? The question hung in the air like smoke from Roberto's cigarettes. Miguel realized that while he'd been noticing the changes, the subtle shifts in their family's circumstances, Carmen had been shielded from the darker implications. She knew about the scholarship, celebrated it as validation of her hard work. She didn't know it had appeared without application, without explanation, like a gift from ghosts. "Nothing, mija," Elena said quickly. "Your brother is just tired from his first day back at work." But Miguel caught the way his mother's eyes flicked toward the balcony, toward the spot where Roberto had stuffed the photograph back into his pocket. Whatever was in that picture, it was the key to everything. The shooting, the mysterious payments, the fear that followed him through the streets of Barrio Antioquia like a shadow with teeth. As if summoned by Miguel's thoughts, a motorcycle engine growled to life somewhere in the distance, its sound echoing off the concrete walls of their neighborhood. Roberto tensed immediately, moving to the window to peer through the curtains. Elena's breathing quickened. "It's nothing," Roberto said after a moment, but he didn't move away from the window. "Just kids." Miguel watched his father's reflection in the glass, noting the way Roberto's eyes constantly scanned the street, the practiced way he stayed to one side of the window frame. These weren't the movements of a simple mechanic worried about neighborhood crime. These were the movements of a man who knew exactly what kind of danger might come looking for his family. The motorcycle engine died abruptly, plunging the neighborhood into an unnatural silence that made Miguel's skin crawl. Even Carmen seemed to sense something wrong. She'd stopped fidgeting with her napkin and sat frozen in her chair like a rabbit caught in headlights. Roberto remained at the window, his body coiled tight as a spring. Outside, Miguel could hear normal evening sounds resuming. Children playing soccer in the street, televisions murmuring through thin walls, the distant clatter of dishes being washed. But underneath it all was something else, a watching quality that made the hair on his arms stand up. "Maybe we should clear the table," Elena suggested, her voice artificially bright. She began stacking plates with jerky, nervous movements that made the ceramic clink together like chattering teeth. That's when Miguel saw them. Two men had appeared at the corner where Señora Martinez sold her empanadas, but her cart was gone now, and the old woman nowhere to be seen. The men wore ordinary clothes, jeans, button-down shirts, sneakers that had seen better days, but they stood with the rigid posture of soldiers. One lit a cigarette while scanning the street, his gaze lingering on each house. The other checked his watch with the mechanical precision of someone following a schedule. "Papa!" Miguel's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The corner." Roberto's curse was low and vicious. He spun away from the window, grabbing Elena's arm with enough force to make her gasp. "Take Carmen to your sister's house. Now!" "What's happening?" Carmen's voice cracked with fear. "Miguel, what's—" "Go with Mama," Miguel said, standing slowly. His shoulders screamed in protest, but adrenaline was already flooding his system, making everything sharp and clear. "Pack a bag, just clothes, nothing else." "I'm not leaving without knowing." "Carmen!" Roberto's bark made all of them jump. "This isn't a discussion." Elena was already moving, pulling Carmen toward the back of the house with trembling hands. Miguel could hear dresser drawers slamming open, his mother's urgent whispers barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "Who are they?" Miguel asked his father. Roberto's hand went instinctively to his shirt pocket, to the photograph hidden there. "People who ask questions I can't answer anymore. Because of me, because of what I did that night, because of what we both did." Roberto's eyes met his son's, and Miguel saw something crumble behind them. Different nights, maybe, but the same mistake. The words hit Miguel like a physical blow. "You knew him, the man at La Cantina. You knew who he was when I told you what happened." Roberto nodded slowly, the admission seeming to age him 10 years in as many seconds. "I recognized the description. The way you talked about his eyes, how familiar they seemed. I'd hoped I was wrong. Who is he?" Before Roberto could answer, Elena reappeared with Carmen in tow, both carrying small backpacks. Carmen's face was streaked with tears, but she'd stopped asking questions. Sometimes silence was its own answer. "The back way," Roberto said, moving toward the kitchen. "Through the Morales' yard, then circle around to Isabel's." Miguel grabbed his father's arm. "I'm not running, not until you tell me what's in that photograph. Miguel, please." "No." The word came out harder than Miguel intended. "I took a bullet for a stranger, and now my family is running scared in our own neighborhood. I deserve to know why." Roberto looked toward the front window, where one of the men was now walking slowly down their street, checking house numbers with deliberate care. Time was running out. "He's not just anyone," Roberto whispered, his voice breaking. "The man you saved. His name is Pablo Escobar." The name hit Miguel like ice water in his veins. Everyone in Medellin knew that name, whispered in bars, mentioned in hushed conversations that stopped when children entered rooms. The ghost who controlled the cocaine trade, the shadow behind half the violence that plagued their city. The man whose reach extended into every corner of Colombian life from the presidential palace to the humblest barrio. "And you," Miguel's voice failed him. "I worked for him. Years ago, before you were born, before I met your mother." Roberto's words tumbled out in a desperate rush. "I thought I was done with all that, thought he'd forgotten about me, but when you described the man you saved, when the money started appearing—" He pulled the photograph from his pocket with shaking hands. "I had to be sure." Miguel stared at the folded paper that contained answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask. Outside, footsteps echoed on their front walk, slow and deliberate. Carmen whimpered softly, and Elena pulled her closer. Roberto held out the photograph like an offering. "Once you see this, there's no going back. You'll understand why they're here, why your act of courage marked us all. But you'll also have to choose." Miguel's hand hesitated inches from the photograph. In that moment he realized his childhood was balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for his decision to push it one way or the other. Miguel's hand trembled in the space between innocence and knowledge, the photograph seeming to pulse with dangerous energy beneath his father's shaking fingers. The footsteps on their front walk grew closer, measured, patient, inevitable. "Choose what?" Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible over the thundering of his own heartbeat. "Whether to know the truth about who you really saved," Roberto said, sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening chill, "or whether to stay the boy who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." Carmen's quiet sobbing filled the kitchen, and Miguel felt the weight of his family's fear pressing down on him like a physical thing. He thought about the scholarship letter that had arrived for his sister, about the hospital bills that had vanished like morning mist, about the way people in the neighborhood looked at him now with a mixture of awe and terror that made his skin crawl. Pablo Escobar. The name echoed in his mind like a death sentence. "If I look at this," Miguel said slowly, "what changes?" "Everything." Elena's voice cut through the darkness, sharp with desperation. "Mijo, please. Some doors should never be opened." But Miguel was already remembering fragments: the businessman's expensive watch, the way he'd carried himself with quiet authority despite his ordinary appearance, the calculating look in his eyes during that split second before Miguel had thrown himself forward. Details that had seemed meaningless at the time now felt heavy with significance. The footsteps stopped directly outside their front door. "Miguel." Roberto's voice was urgent now, barely controlled panic bleeding through. "The back door. Now. We can figure this out later." "No." The word surprised Miguel with its firmness. "I won't spend my life running from something I don't understand." His hand moved toward the photograph, and Roberto jerked it back reflexively. "You don't know what you're asking for. This knowledge, it makes you complicit. It makes you a target." "I'm already a target," Miguel hissed. "Look around, Papa. We're already running. Carmen's crying, Mama's terrified, and you've been jumping at shadows for weeks. Whatever protection my ignorance was supposed to give us, it's already gone." A gentle knock echoed through the house, polite, almost courteous. The sound made Miguel's blood run cold because it was so ordinary, so civilized. Somehow that was more terrifying than if they'd simply kicked the door down. Señor Santos? A voice called from the front step, cultured and patient. We'd like to speak with you about your son. Nothing more. Roberto closed his eyes, and Miguel saw defeat settle over his father's features like dust. They know we're here. They probably knew before they knocked. Elena clutched Carmen tighter, both of them pressed against the far wall of the kitchen, as if they could disappear into the concrete blocks. Miguel felt a strange calm descending over him, the same focused clarity he'd experienced in La Cantina Dorada just before he'd thrown himself at the stranger. The photograph, he said quietly. If I'm going to face this, I need to know what I'm facing. Roberto looked at his son for a long moment, and Miguel saw something shift in his father's expression, a recognition, perhaps, that the boy who'd left for work that morning was already gone, replaced by someone older and harder. Once you know, Roberto said, you can't go back to believing you're just an innocent kid who made a brave mistake. You'll understand that courage and stupidity aren't always different things, and that heroism can damn you just as easily as cowardice. Another knock, still patient, but with an edge of steel underneath. Miguel thought about Carmen's scholarship, about walking through his own neighborhood and seeing fear in his neighbor's eyes, about the way his scar throbbed whenever he remembered those calculating eyes staring up at him from the cantina floor. He was already caught in something larger than himself. The only question was whether he'd face it blind or with his eyes open. I need to know, he said finally. Roberto's hand shook as he began to unfold the photograph, then stopped. What if I'm wrong? What if knowing destroys what's left of our family? What if not knowing does? Miguel countered. The voice from the front step called again, still polite but with less patience. Señor Santos, we'd prefer to keep this conversation private, for everyone's sake. Miguel looked at his sister, huddled against their mother, her young face streaked with tears and confusion. She deserved better than this, better than mysterious scholarships and midnight flights and the constant weight of unspoken dangers. But she also deserved a brother who understood the forces that threatened them. He reached for the photograph again, and this time Roberto didn't pull it away. Some knowledge burns, his father warned. Then I'll learn to live with the burns, Miguel said, his fingers closing over the folded paper that would change everything. Miguel's fingers unfolded the photograph with deliberate slowness, as if he could somehow control the magnitude of what he was about to learn by controlling the speed of revelation. The paper crackled softly in the silence, each fold releasing another fragment of his father's buried past. The image that emerged made his breath catch in his throat. It was Roberto, but a Roberto from another lifetime, younger, wearing a crisp white shirt and expensive sunglasses, standing beside a sleek motorcycle in what looked like a warehouse, and next to him, arm casually draped around his father's shoulders like they were old friends, was the man from La Cantina Dorada. Even in the faded photograph, those calculating eyes were unmistakable. Pablo Escobar smiled at the camera with the easy confidence of someone who owned everything he could see. Miguel's knees went weak. The photograph trembled in his hands as the full weight of understanding crashed over him. He hadn't saved a random businessman. He'd thrown his body between bullets and the most dangerous man in Colombia. The man whose name was whispered like a curse, whose empire stretched from the barrios of Medellin to the cocaine-hungry streets of Miami. When? Miguel's voice came out as a croak. 1975, Roberto whispered. I was your age, desperate for work, for money to help my own father who was sick. Pablo was just starting to build his organization, and he needed people who could fix his vehicles, maintain his equipment. His father's voice grew hollow. I told myself it was just mechanical work, that I wasn't really part of it. The knocking at the front door had stopped, replaced by the soft sound of conversation between the two men outside. Miguel could hear fragments, professional, patient words that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. How long? Miguel asked, unable to look away from the photograph. In it, his father looked so young, so proud. The motorcycle behind them was pristine, clearly expensive, the kind of machine that represented dreams of escape from poverty. 2 years, Roberto said, until I realized that being useful to Pablo Escobar was like being useful to a fire. Eventually, you get burned. He touched his left hand unconsciously, and for the first time Miguel noticed the thin white scar running across his father's knuckles. I got out before things went too far. Changed my name, moved to a different part of the city, met your mother. I thought it was finished. Elena's quiet weeping filled the kitchen like a prayer for forgiveness. Carmen had gone silent, her dark eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from watching your entire world reshape itself in real time. Miguel studied his father's face in the photograph, then looked at the man standing before him now, older, worn down by years of honest work and hidden fear. He let you go? Roberto's laugh was bitter. Pablo doesn't let anyone go. But he was building an empire then, not protecting one. Small fish like me weren't worth the trouble to hunt down. His voice dropped to a whisper, until now, until his life was saved by Roberto Santos's boy. The pieces clicked together in Miguel's mind like tumblers in a lock. The mysterious payments, the scholarship, the way his family's debts had simply vanished. These weren't random acts of charity. They were recognition, acknowledgement. Escobar repaying a debt to the son of a former associate who had chosen to disappear rather than become a liability. He knows, Miguel said, the words tasting like ash. He knows who I am, who you are. The moment you told me what happened, I knew it was only a matter of time. Roberto nodded. Pablo never forgets a face, never forgets a favor, and he never leaves debts unpaid. A soft scratching sound came from the front door. Not knocking now, but something else. Miguel's blood turned to ice as he realized what it was. Someone picking the lock with professional precision. The back door, Elena whispered urgently, but Roberto was shaking his head. Too late for running. His voice carried a strange calm, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders by finally sharing the truth. If they wanted us dead, we'd already be dead. This is something else. Miguel looked down at the photograph one more time, memorizing every detail. His father's young face, Escobar's confident smile, the warehouse background that spoke of money and power and choices that echoed across decades. Then he carefully refolded the paper and handed it back to Roberto. Keep it, he said quietly, but from now on, no more secrets, no more lies. If I'm going to be Pablo Escobar's debtor, if my family is going to live under his protection or his threat, then I need to understand the rules. The scratching at the front door stopped. In the sudden silence, Miguel could hear his own heartbeat, his sister's ragged breathing, his mother's whispered prayers. When the door finally opened with a soft click, Miguel Santos, 17 years old, mechanic's son, reluctant hero, stood up straighter and prepared to meet his destiny. There was no going back now. The boy who had worked on cars and worried about his stutter was gone, replaced by someone who understood that courage and consequence were forever intertwined. The door swung open with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there, and Miguel felt his entire world narrow to a single point of focus. The man who entered wasn't the businessman from La Cantina Dorada, but he carried the same aura of controlled power. Mid-30s, unremarkable face, expensive shoes that had been carefully scuffed to look ordinary. Buenas noches, Familia Santos, the man said, his voice carrying the educated accent of Bogotá money. Behind him, a second figure remained silhouetted in the doorway. Younger, broader, hands clasped loosely at his waist. Please, don't be alarmed. We're here to talk, nothing more. Roberto stepped forward, placing himself between the stranger and his family. What do you want? The man smiled, and Miguel noticed it never reached his eyes. I think you know, Roberto. May I call you Roberto? We have a mutual friend who speaks very highly of your family. His gaze shifted to Miguel, studying him with the clinical interest of someone evaluating livestock. Especially your brave son. Miguel felt his throat close up, the familiar stutter threatening to surface under the weight of the man's attention. But he forced himself to speak anyway. Who are you? Someone who appreciates courage, the man replied smoothly. Someone who recognizes that extraordinary actions deserve extraordinary consideration. He moved deeper into the kitchen, his steps measured and deliberate. Your father never told you about the old days, did he? About the choices that young men sometimes make when their families are hungry. That was a long time ago, Roberto said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. I walked away. Yes, you did. The man nodded approvingly. Quietly, cleanly, without drawing attention to yourself or causing problems for anyone. That kind of discretion is rare. Valuable. His attention returned to Miguel. It seems good judgment runs in the family. Carmen whimpered softly, and Elena pulled her closer. The second man in the doorway shifted slightly, a movement that Miguel's heightened senses read as both casual and threatening. These weren't thugs or street soldiers. They moved with the precision of professionals, people who understood that real power didn't need to announce itself. What my son did was instinct, Roberto said carefully. He didn't know who he was protecting? The man's smile widened. Of course not. That's what makes it so remarkable. Pure courage, untainted by calculation or self-interest. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately telegraphing the movement, and withdrew a white envelope. Our friend wanted to express his gratitude personally, but circumstances make that inadvisable, so he sent me instead. Miguel stared at the envelope, understanding instinctively that whatever it contained would push them deeper into a world they barely understood. We don't want money. It's not money, the man said, seeming genuinely amused, though I understand why you might think so. Your family's debts, your sister's education, the hospital bills, those were simple courtesies. This is something different. He set the envelope on the kitchen table with deliberate care. This is an invitation. Roberto's face went pale. An invitation to what? To understand your position, the man replied. You see, your son's heroic act has created what we might call a situation. Word travels fast in certain circles, and there are people, competitors shall we say, who might view Miguel's protection of our mutual friend as evidence of a family allegiance. Miguel felt ice forming in his stomach. What kind of people? The man's expression grew serious for the first time. The kind who don't distinguish between active allies and accidental heroes. The kind who might decide that eliminating potential threats is simpler than investigating their actual loyalties. Elena's sharp intake of breath cut through the kitchen like a blade. Miguel saw his mother's face crumple with the understanding that their nightmare was just beginning. But our friend is not without resources, the man continued smoothly. Nor is he without a sense of honor. What your son did that night, that kind of courage deserves protection, reciprocity. He gestured toward the envelope. Inside you'll find instructions, simple guidelines for staying safe while we resolve certain complications. Miguel's hands clenched into fists. What if we refuse? The man studied him with something that might have been respect. Then you'll be on your own against people who view your continued existence as a problem to be solved. He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. Your father understands these realities, don't you, Roberto? Roberto's nod was barely perceptible, the movement of a man acknowledging a trap he'd walked into 28 years earlier. The choice is yours, the man said, moving toward the door. But understand, there is no neutral ground in this world. You're either protected or you're prey. He paused at the threshold, his professional demeanor softening slightly. For what it's worth, your son's courage that night impressed more people than just our mutual friend. Such loyalty shouldn't go unrewarded. As the two men disappeared into the night, Miguel stared at the envelope on the table, understanding that 17 years of innocence had just ended with the soft click of his front door closing. The silence that followed the men's departure felt heavier than the humid Medellin air. Miguel stared at the white envelope on the kitchen table as if it might explode, while his family remained frozen in their positions. Elena clutching Carmen against the far wall, Roberto standing guard between them and the door that had just closed on their old life. Don't touch it, Elena whispered, her voice breaking. Por favor, Miguel. Don't touch that thing. But Miguel was already reaching for it, his hands steadier than he'd expected. The envelope was expensive paper, heavy stock that spoke of money and influence. His name was written across the front in elegant script, Miguel Santos, El Valiente, the brave one. The words made his scar throb. Whatever's in there, Roberto said quietly. Once you read it, we can't pretend we don't know. We can't pretend we have a choice. Miguel's fingers traced the sealed edge. Through the paper he could feel multiple documents, perhaps photographs. We don't have a choice anyway, do we? That man made it clear. We're already targets. Carmen spoke for the first time since the men had entered. I don't want to go to America anymore. Her voice was small, frightened. I want to stay here with you. The words hit Miguel like a physical blow. His sister's scholarship, her chance at a future beyond the barrios, beyond the cycle of poverty and violence that trapped families like theirs, was tainted now. Everything that had seemed like miraculous good fortune was revealed as something darker, more complicated. You're going, he said firmly, looking at her tear-streaked face. Whatever else happens, you're getting out of this. And leave you here to… What? Carmen's voice rose, angry now. To become like Papa? To spend your life looking over your shoulder, jumping every time someone knocks on the door? Roberto flinched as if she'd slapped him. Miguel saw his father's face crumple slightly, years of hidden shame finally surfacing under the weight of his daughter's accusation. Your father did what he had to do to survive, Elena said sharply, defending her husband even as her world collapsed around them. We all did what we had to do. And look where it got us, Carmen shot back. Miguel saves one person's life, and suddenly we're hiding in our own kitchen, terrified of envelopes. Miguel felt something cold and hard crystallizing in his chest. Not fear exactly, but a kind of grim acceptance. His family was fracturing under the pressure of forces they couldn't control, and all because he'd acted on instinct in a moment of crisis. The irony wasn't lost on him. His attempt to protect a stranger had ultimately endangered the people he loved most. Stop, he said quietly, and something in his voice made them all look at him. This isn't Papa's fault. It's not Carmen's fault. It's mine. He picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. I made the choice in that cantina. I threw myself in front of those bullets. Everything that followed, that's on me. You saved someone's life, Roberto said desperately. That's not something to… I saved Pablo Escobar's life, Miguel corrected, the name feeling like poison on his tongue. The most dangerous man in Colombia, the man whose organization kills judges and police officers and innocent people every day. He looked around at his family, seeing his own guilt reflected in their faces. How do I live with that knowledge? How do I look at Carmen's scholarship money, knowing it's paid for with cocaine profits and blood? Elena moved away from the wall, approaching her son with careful steps as if he might bolt. Because the alternative is watching your family suffer for something you can't change, because sometimes there are no clean choices, mijo. Only choices that let you protect the people you love. Miguel thought about the man who'd just left, his polite threats wrapped in elegant language, the casual way he'd described Miguel's family as either protected or prey. This was the world his father had tried to escape, the world that had reclaimed them the moment Miguel's courage had marked him as someone significant. Open it, Roberto said suddenly, his voice carrying a strange finality. Whatever they want from us, whatever they're offering or demanding, we need to know. Miguel's thumb slipped under the envelope's seal, and he felt it give way with a soft, tearing sound. Inside were 3 items, a photograph, a handwritten letter, and what looked like a business card made of the same expensive paper as the envelope. The photograph made his breath catch. It was recent, taken sometime in the last few weeks, judging by his healing scar. It showed Miguel walking to work, unaware he was being watched, crossing the street near the auto shop where he'd spent countless hours believing his biggest worry was whether he could afford to help his family pay rent. The message was clear. We know where you are, where you go, how you live. We've been watching. Miguel's hands shook slightly as he reached for the letter, understanding that whatever instructions it contained would determine whether his family's protection came with a price they could bear to pay. Miguel unfolded the letter with deliberate slowness, his father's breathing loud in the sudden quiet. The handwriting was different from the envelope, rougher, more personal, written with the confident strokes of someone accustomed to having his words obeyed without question. Miguel, your courage in La Cantina Dorada has not been forgotten. Neither has your father's loyal service in earlier times, or his wisdom in choosing discretion over conflict when circumstances changed. Unfortunately, your heroism has attracted unwanted attention. The Cali organization believes your family represents a renewed alliance between myself and certain Medellin interests. They are wrong, but their error could prove fatal for you and those you love. Tomorrow evening, you will receive visitors. Not my people, but theirs. They will come asking questions about that night, about what you saw, what you heard, what you remember about the man you protected. Your answers will determine whether they view you as an innocent bystander or a deliberate accomplice. I cannot protect you from this interrogation without confirming their suspicions. You must face it alone, as you face those bullets, with courage, but also with intelligence. Tell them nothing useful. Remember nothing clearly. Stutter more than usual. Let them think you are simple, frightened, confused. Your life depends on convincing dangerous men that saving me was random chance, not family loyalty. If you succeed in this deception, your sister's departure for America will be accelerated. She leaves in 3 days, not 3 weeks. Distance will keep her safe from any complications. The card enclosed will connect you to people who can provide emergency assistance, but use it only if you have no other choice. Any contact with my organization will validate their suspicions about your family's allegiances. Your father will understand the rules of this game. Trust his guidance. You acted with honor when it mattered. Now you must act with cunning to survive the consequences. P.E. Miguel's hands trembled as he passed the letter to Roberto, watching his father's face pale with each line. The business card was simple, just a phone number embossed in gold, nothing else. No name, no address, just digits that represented a lifeline they couldn't afford to use. 3 days? Carmen's voice cracked as she processed the timeline. I can't leave in 3 days. I'm not ready. You'll be ready, Elena said firmly, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. We'll make you ready. Roberto set the letter down carefully, his movements precise and controlled. The Cali Cartel, he said quietly, as if speaking the name too loudly might summon them. They're not like Pablo's people. No honor, no rules except profit and paranoia. His eyes met Miguel's. If they believe you're connected to Escobar, they won't just kill you. They'll make an example. Miguel felt his world tilting on its axis. The man he'd saved, this Pablo Escobar, was pulling strings to protect them. But that protection required Miguel to walk into mortal danger with nothing but his wits and his stutter as shields. How am I supposed to convince trained killers that I'm just some stupid kid who got lucky? By remembering that you were just some stupid kid who got lucky, Roberto replied. Before you knew his name, before you understood what you'd done, you were innocent. Find that version of yourself. Become him again. Carmen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. We should run. Pack everything tonight and disappear before... Before what? Miguel interrupted. Before men with unlimited resources and government connections decide we're worth hunting? Before they kill Papa for what he knew 28 years ago? He gestured toward the letter. Escobar's right. Running proves guilt. Staying proves innocence. Or gets you killed, Elena whispered. Miguel looked at his mother, this woman who'd worked double shifts cleaning other people's houses, who'd stretched every peso to keep food on their table, who'd prayed every night for her children's safety, and felt something harden in his chest. Not courage this time, but determination born from pure necessity. Maybe, he admitted. But if I do this right, if I convince them I'm nothing more than an unlucky witness, Carmen gets her future and you get your lives back. He picked up the photograph of himself, studying the unconscious confidence on his face from just weeks ago. I need to practice being that person again. The one who didn't know that a single moment of bravery could destroy everything. Roberto reached across the table and gripped his son's wrist. Miguel, listen to me carefully. These men who are coming, they'll hurt you to test your reactions. They'll threaten your family to see if you break. They'll offer you money, drugs, women, anything to make you admit to knowledge you don't possess. His fingers tightened. The only thing keeping you alive will be their belief that you're worthless. Miguel nodded, understanding that tomorrow night would either free them or damn them all. Pablo Escobar had given him a chance to save his family, but the price was convincing the most dangerous men in Colombia that his heroism had been nothing more than teenage stupidity. The boy who'd thrown himself in front of bullets was about to face his greatest test yet. The rain started at dusk the next evening, drumming against the corrugated roof like bullets, a sound that made Miguel's scar ache with phantom pain. He sat at the kitchen table practicing his stutter, forcing the words to catch and stumble until they sounded natural again. I don't remember much. It happened so fast. Carmen's suitcase sat by the front door, hastily packed with everything that could fit. 3 days had become 2, then 1, as mysterious phone calls moved up her departure time with each passing hour. She would leave for the airport at dawn, before the questions could follow her to America. "They're here," Roberto whispered from the window, his voice tight with the kind of fear Miguel had never heard from his father before. 2 cars this time, not the single sedan from Pablo's emissaries. Men emerged from both vehicles, 6 in total, moving with predatory efficiency through the rain. These weren't polite messengers in expensive suits. These were soldiers. Miguel's carefully rehearsed words evaporated as the front door exploded inward, hinges torn from rotted wood by a single kick. The men who poured into their small house brought the scent of gunpowder and violence, their faces hard with the kind of cruelty that found pleasure in fear. Miguel Santos. The leader's voice carried a thick accent from Cali, each syllable sharp as broken glass. The famous hero. Miguel tried to stutter, to project the nervous confusion he'd practiced, but his throat had closed completely. The man approaching him wasn't interested in subtle interrogation or psychological games. His eyes held the flat emptiness of someone who'd killed so often it had become mundane. "Please," Miguel finally managed, the fear in his voice entirely real now. "I don't understand." The backhand sent him sprawling, his chair clattering to the floor. Stars exploded across his vision as his healing scar split open, fresh blood running down his neck. Elena's scream cut through the air like a siren. "Let's try this again," the man said pleasantly, as if he hadn't just shattered Miguel's carefully planned deception with casual violence. "You threw yourself in front of bullets meant for Pablo Escobar. Your family's debts disappeared overnight. Your sister gets a scholarship to America." He crouched beside Miguel, who was struggling to sit up against the overturned table. "You expect us to believe this is coincidence?" Miguel's prepared story, his carefully crafted innocence, lay in ruins around him like the broken chair. The blood flowing from his reopened wound was already undermining his attempt to seem harmless, marking him as someone who'd been close enough to violence to bear its scars. "We know your father used to cook for the Medellin organization," another man said, producing a manila folder thick with photographs. Roberto's face from decades earlier stared up at them, younger, harder, standing beside men Miguel recognized from newspaper headlines about cartel violence. "We know Pablo takes care of the families of old friends." Carmen whimpered from the corner where Elena held her, and the sound broke something fundamental in Miguel's chest. All of his planning, all of Pablo's careful instructions, were meaningless now. These men hadn't come seeking the truth. They'd come to deliver a message written in blood. "The boy knows nothing," Roberto said desperately, stepping forward despite the guns swinging toward him. "I worked for Pablo 28 years ago, yes, but Miguel was innocent." "Was," the leader agreed. Past tense. He grabbed Miguel's hair, forcing his face up toward the light. "But innocence has an expiration date, doesn't it? The moment your blood mixed with Pablo's on that cantina floor, you stopped being a random teenager. You became a symbol." Miguel felt his world collapsing with crystalline clarity. He wasn't going to talk his way out of this. These men hadn't come for information. They'd come to eliminate what they saw as a propaganda victory for their enemies. The boy who'd saved Pablo Escobar couldn't be allowed to live and inspire others to similar acts of loyalty. "Your sister leaves for America in the morning," the man continued conversationally, producing a photograph of Carmen at the airport, clearly taken within the last few hours. "Interesting timing, don't you think? Almost like someone wants to get her to safety before—" "No." Miguel's voice came out stronger than he'd intended, the last of his pretense falling away. "She doesn't know anything. She's just a child." "Children grow up," the man replied. "Children remember stories about their heroic brothers who died protecting the great Pablo Escobar. Children become martyrs that inspire the next generation of sicarios." Miguel understood then that he'd lost everything before the game had even begun. Carmen would never make it to that plane. His parents would die for Roberto's ancient loyalty, and Miguel himself had become something he'd never wanted to be. Not a hero, but a liability that needed elimination. Pablo Escobar's protection had proved worthless against men who saw murder as the simplest solution to complex problems. The boy who'd saved a stranger was about to discover that some acts of courage carry prices that can never be paid.